things are changing. And as they change, they're going to drive competition. The difficult part about this is, at least up until now, certainly we've had a sufficient reservoir of either natural resources, intellectual capacity to adapt, you name it, and so we have stayed on the front side of that curve for the most part as a planet. Okay? But what happens when you put a financial crisis with a climate problem with a weapon of mass destruction? Do you get to the point where you're at a so-called tipping point? Where is that tipping point? How close are we today versus our ability to adapt? Those are very fuzzy lines, and you approach them kind of tiptoeing and trying to figure out, are we there, aren't we? Will we have control of how quickly we approach those lines? I would guarantee you no.
Small business lending is one area that we are flagging as an area suffering credit contraction, where we want banks, again with these new supports, to engage in more small business lending. That's a key driver of job growth, as you know. Also, community banks, we've been very vigorous proponents of making sure that the smaller community banks are included in the ability to get TARP funding for capital investments, because they are heavily a source of smaller business loans. So I think we tackle support of small business on that front, but we're not really a contracting or procurement agency.
Well, the premise of my comments is that we can either watch or react to change, or we can use change to shape our future success. And I believe that what we have to do, not just at Grant Thornton, but at any business, at any organization, at any university or any governmental agency, is use the change that we're seeing, as painful as it may be, to shape our future and use it in a very positive way.
Because unlike the networks of old, which were separate, discrete, these networks are now combined. But more, your presence on that network is not restricted to the time that you choose to be on that network. Your presence on that network is permanent. When I used a telephone growing up in Linthicum, 10 miles away, as a kid in the 1960s, when I hung up that phone, that conversation was over. There was no record of that, absent the possible billing, right, of a long distance or a local call, but a billing record. That was it. There was no content recordation of that communication. Today, whether you are on the net or not, whether you are aware of the net or not, you're on it. There are institutions, from the government to financial to all sorts of folks trying to kind of find you and sell things to you, that are collecting information on a fairly regular basis and combining that treasure on the internet and making that available to all manner of people, most of whom you would expect would use that information in an appropriate and legitimate way, but not all of whom do.
But we've developed a very deep conviction that if we are to treat the root causes of global instability, the only way to really address ideological difficulties or cultural or economic strains is to examine the root causes and to be able to synthesize from a very broad array of experience and capabilities solutions that people understand that bring real value into their lives and that governments can see bring real value to the populations they represent. And we are quite confident that every contemporary leader today must be a global leader. You cannot be isolated and you cannot be insulated from global circumstances.
All government officials have a commitment to setting fair and simple frameworks, and then we should try and get out of the way and allow our businesses, large and small, to flourish. But our belief remains that that won't happen unless we ensure that our future prosperity continues to lie in open markets.
One of the most important factors, therefore, ensuring that a board functions effectively to meet all these responsibilities is having the right tone at the top. We often hear the phrase, particularly with regard to accounting, but it's true throughout the organization. The tone at the top shapes corporate culture. It permeates the corporation's relationships with all its constituents, investors, employees, customers, suppliers, regulators, local communities, and other constituents. And the board should work with the CEO and senior management to actively cultivate a corporate culture that gives high priority to ethical standards, principles of fair dealing, professionalism, integrity, compliance, and legal requirements to ensure that the company's strategic goals are ethically sound. So in setting this kind of tone at the top, I think transparency and communication is key.
Because I would believe that leadership cannot be limited to the so-called global centers like New York, London, and Tokyo, because ideas don't have zip codes or country codes. Global leadership can also come from a Baltimore, a Pasadena, a Melbourne, a Sao Paulo.
Technology is another one. This is very, in Cycrosen, I remember I do this in talks, about 50% of R&D is wasted. We always talk about marketing, 50% of marketing is wasted, you just don't know what half. In this particular side, this whole area in technology, and this is what we as a company need to do, is how do you differentiate yourself? The data is overwhelming. When you compete in a circle, and I'll use Jeffrey Moore again, wrote Crossing the Chasm, you know, you talk the circle you compete, and you go in there and your new product is a little bit better than that guy's, and next week his product's a little bit better than you. Changing market share, changing the dynamics of the profit pool is very, very hard. You've got to be able to make change.
For a long time, it was thought that if you wanted to get something, you had to take it from somebody else, sort of a zero-sum mentality. But especially Franklin and Hamilton understood that if you provide the right environment, your success can be other people's success. And in terms of the ambition to get ahead, that's not greed. If you have certain talents, you should have a society that will enable you to realize and develop those talents to the fullest. That's not immoral. That's almost a duty if you have those kinds of talents to develop them. You get ahead, but others get ahead.
Now, I suggest if we're serious about closing the wealth gap, we must first, and this is where I think it gets provocative to some extent, we must be willing to talk about what I call race recognition remedies. And this discussion must take place at the highest levels of government, as well as between black and white Americans. Now, I recognize, as I said earlier, that public policy based on race is extremely provocative and controversial. But controversy should not prevent a reasonable dialogue about a societal dilemma that is real and potentially economically devastating to millions of African Americans.